Hello, this is Mark Galeotti from the Institute of International Relations, Prague. Now, yesterday, Russia went to the polls to elect the new State Duma, the lower chamber of the legislature. And on one level, this was essentially described as the most boring elections post-Soviet Russia has ever had. And they were. But on the other hand, there are actually three reasons why I think these elections are actually going to prove really quite important. First of all, the turnout, which was a disastrously low figure. We don't know the exact numbers yet, but we're talking about 48%, which is down from just over 60% the last time they had these elections. Now, why that really matters is this. The chamber, the actual composition, is going to look pretty much the same as the previous parliament. But that doesn't matter. This is not a parliament that really matters. It doesn't count. It doesn't make the decisions. It is there really just to rubber stamp what the Kremlin decides. But these elections have always been, for want of a better word, theatre, legitimating rituals. They're about showing that the country is united behind Putin. And when you can only get less than half of the electorate out to vote, that says something. It says something about disillusion, about people believing that, frankly, that none of this matters. And this is particularly important because this autumn, because of the economic crisis, almost certainly Russia will have to impose some new austerity measures, which are going to be tough and going to be unpopular. And so what Putin needed was a really good vote in order to give him the mandate, and he's not got that. He'll still push forward with the austerity measures, but he won't have that same legitimacy behind him. Second reason that this is important is essentially that what it says about the Kremlin losing its grip on the political system. At first, when they originally made the decisions about this vote, they probably decided that a low turnout was going to be quite good for them. It would make it easier to control. And that's why they scheduled the elections for September, and they made a whole variety of other moves, intended to try and bring down the tone of the debate. I think they were worried about the opposition using it as a platform to present their views. It soon became clear that that was a big mistake. And recently, they've actually were trying desperately to bring the turnout up. And as I said, they failed in that. And they made a whole collection of other decisions which also, in hindsight, are likely to prove mistakes. They switched the basis of the whole electoral system to have a whole series of single mandate constituencies representing half the total. In other words, people voted not off party lists, but from particular locations. Again, they thought that would make them more controllable. In fact, what they now have is a bunch of people who have to worry about what their constituents back home think. And so this coming Duma is likely to be one that's much, much harder to control, with a lot of people pushing for the interests of people back home. Not because they're good people, because they know they need to be re-elected. So for a whole variety of reasons, I think what we're seeing is a Kremlin regime which once upon a time seemed absolutely masterful in its own ruthless way in controlling the political process, to on one hand create the illusion of democracy, but on the other hand control it absolutely. We've seen now two successive elections in which they have failed to control the narrative, and although they control the parliament, they don't control the political process. Now, we're not going to see mass protests on the streets or anything like that. This is instead part of a slow, muddy delegitimization of the regime, a slide away from the peaks when Putin seemed absolutely indomitable. And that particularly matters because next year we have the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The communists, who up to now have basically been willing to play the role of the tame, fake opposition, well, they're now facing a new, younger generation of members who actually want to genuinely be an opposition force. So we'll have to see how next year plays out. And then in 2018, we have the presidential elections, the all-important ones. Putin is almost certainly going to stand. And if he does stand, he'll make sure he wins. That's not in question. The question is, in a way, how much pressure, how much so-called administrative resource, buying off members of the electorate and that kind of thing, how much outright rigging will need to be done in order to ensure that. So this is why these elections matter. Last reason is an international reason. For the first time, these elections included votes being cast in Crimea, since it was annexed by the Russians in 2014. And already there's a lot of protest about this in the West, people saying that these elections therefore shouldn't be legitimate, they shouldn't deal with the parliament at all. Now I don't think that's going to happen. Not least because there are many other legislatures around the world which include votes or representatives from annexed territories, especially the Chinese, which includes Tibet. But nonetheless, what this does mean is that every single time we now have a Russian parliamentary delegation coming to the West, or a Western parliamentary delegation meeting their counterparts in Russia, this issue is going to be raised. They're going to have to decide, protocol-wise, how to handle this, how to demonstrate that they're willing to talk to the Russians, but not to accept the legitimacy of their seizure of Crimea. This is terrible for the Russians, because in a way, they wanted to take Crimea off the table. They wanted to make it just a fait accompli that no one ever talks about. And now, every single time there's going to be these kind of bilateral contacts, Crimea is going to be part of the conversation. So for a whole variety of reasons, this is why I think these elections were definitely one of the dullest campaigns I've had the misery of having to watch. And the results are pretty much exactly the same in terms of the seats within Parliament as the previous ones, but nonetheless, for all that, these really do matter. I'm Mark Galeotti of the Institute of International Relations, Prague.